Text in Photoshop. Why do you think I covered this last? I'll tell you why, and that is because text in Photoshop is pixels, and I don't use pixels with text. So here's the reason. Later on down the road, if I go to print this out and I get some fantastical printer, the problem is the text is in pixels, it's not vectorized. So vectors allow you to scale up text or shrink down text. It always stays true to the outside edge. And you'll appreciate that in Illustrator the best because it makes some really nice text. So as a web person, I use text in Photoshop. As a printer, I do not do any text in Photoshop. But here's a workflow that you can do as a student, and teachers, if you're listening to this, this is a very cool assignment for students. So first off, let's look at the text tool and a couple of the attributes here. I'm going to type out a word, Google. Okay. Everybody knows this word, right? So let's highlight the word and go into the character palette. Please note that all of the Adobe suite has a character palette. You should seek out this character palette as best you can because sometimes you're not able to see what the font looks like. Here in the character palette you can. So let's talk about things. Let's talk about tracking, which gives you the ability to squish text or make text with more spacing between it. Here I can make characters taller if I wanted to or wider. I can also use the scale tool, but it looks a lot better if you use these. Okay, certain things you can't change in certain amounts of fonts. This, if I had 2 rows of fonts, I could use it, but I don't. If I highlight one letter, I can make it a little bit different. So oftentimes I can make this a little bit physically taller, a little bit physically bigger, and then I can adjust it in such a way that it sets differently with the rest of the text. Like that. Certain things I didn't cover that I can cover with text is the layer styles. So if I double click here, it brings up the layer style palette. In which case I can go into drop shadow, highlight drop shadow, move this, and now I have a drop shadow in the background. I can lower the opacity down, and now the words start popping off. I got inner shadow, which just gives it the ability to look like it's cut out. So oftentimes, you know, if you have a drop shadow and an inner shadow, it kind of looks nice next to each other. I have outer glow, which only if you have a background. So if I go in here and make a new background, you can really start seeing what outer glow does. So I don't want to go through each and every one of these because they are very easy to use. These outer glow, you know, if you play around with it enough, you get some cool spread, some opacity. If you put the opacity way up, you get this really contrasty look. But it separates the words from the background. Another way to do this is called stroke. So if I do a stroke, I get more of a cartoony look. But it's a good way to separate the background from the actual text. Some other things that I use somewhat all the time is bevel, because that really hits it home. So now it's got kind of a 3D look. And sometimes I use a gradient overlay with it set to multiply. So now you get this whole other look. So very powerful with the layer styles. Works good with text. Other stuff, you're going to have to use your imagination a little bit. So how about background? You know, what I really like to do is kind of put something in this background that would match this text. Now, you can use brushes for this. You can use some texture for this. But remember, these are words, and we don't want to muck up the conversation. So what I mean by that is, if I start adding something super contrasty, super cool in the background, what's the point of the words, right? And I'll show you an example of one of my students' work here in a little bit that perfectly conveys that message. So here's some scattering. Scatter this a little bit. And I stole some color from the words. And I'm just going to kind of scrub in a little bit of texture in the background. And you can see how that affects so much. Now what are you concentrating on? Okay. So be very careful when it comes to texture in the background. Another thing you could do is use color dynamics to use a foreground background color. That way it kind of adds a little bit of a darker color along with it. But again, you're concentrating more on the background. So what I usually tell students is, either use a very low opacity when it comes to texture in the background when you're dealing with words, or a different kind of channel. Okay, so maybe this would be a multiply instead. Okay, keep it very simple. Now, here's an example of it. So this student used brushes, used clip art, used a lot of effects, but it doesn't take away from the message. None of this in the background is the same black as that. The only thing I would say is maybe you should separate a little bit more from this, the background, using maybe outlines or something. But I would say this conveys it nice next to that word. Alright, so please move on to the next video where I kind of go into a little bit more about miscellaneous things within Photoshop.